Blood trickled down Theodora Varley's cheek as she stumbled through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at her bruised ribs. The full moon of 1878 illuminated her path through the dense Colorado forest, miles outside of St. Joe. Behind her, she could still hear the echoes of her husband's threats, promises of what he'd do when he found her. The same promises he'd been keeping for 3 long years. Theo's wedding ring had been discarded miles back, thrown into a creek with the desperate hope that he might follow its path instead of hers. Her once fine blue dress was torn at the hem, snagged by brambles and soaked with creek water and sweat. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't risk being found by the man who had sworn to love her but had only brought pain. Her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling down a short embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, causing her to cry out before clamping a hand over her mouth. The night was still except for the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. "I can't stop," she whispered to herself, using a nearby tree to pull herself upright. "I won't go back." She limped forward, each step sending shards of pain up her leg. The trees grew thicker, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the canopy. Disoriented and exhausted, Theo found herself moving in circles, recognizing the same crooked pine she'd passed twice before. Her strength finally gave out as dawn approached. Collapsing beneath the shelter of a massive oak, Theo curled into herself, shivering as the adrenaline wore off and the reality of her situation set in. She was lost, injured, and alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular, her voice barely audible over the morning bird song. "Please let me be far enough away." Sleep took her then, a fitful rest punctuated by startling awake at every sound. It was the pressure of something cold and wet against her hand that finally brought her fully back to consciousness. Her eyes flew open to find herself staring into the curious face of a dog, a brown and white hound with gentle eyes and floppy ears. "Rusty." A man's voice called from somewhere nearby. "Where'd you get off to, boy?" The dog barked once in response, wagging its tail but not leaving Theo's side. She tried to scramble backward, pressing herself against the trunk of the oak tree, ignoring the fire in her ankle. "There you are, you old." The man stopped short as he pushed aside a branch and spotted her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. A wide-brimmed hat cast shadows across his face, but she could see his expression shift from surprise to concern. "Madam." "Are you hurt?" Theo didn't answer, her throat tight with fear. Her husband had friends throughout the county. This stranger could be one of them. The man took a step closer, then stopped when she flinched. He crouched down, making himself smaller, and pushed his hat back to reveal his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "My name's Preston Wolcott. I run cattle about 5 miles east of here." His voice was gentle, like he was talking to a spooked horse. "That's my dog, Rusty. Seems he found you before I did." The dog, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the ground and gave a soft whine. "You're hurt," the man Preston said, his eyes moving to her swollen ankle, then up to her face, taking in the dried blood on her cheek and the bruises visible on her wrists. Something hardened in his expression, but his voice remained calm. "I've got a cabin not far from here. Clean water, bandages, food if you're hungry." Theo swallowed hard, weighing her options. She couldn't walk much farther on her injured ankle. She had no supplies, no plan beyond running. And there was something in this man's eyes that didn't match the calculating cruelty she'd become accustomed to. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from thirst, Preston nodded as if he'd expected the question. You don't. But I swear on my mother's grave, I mean you no harm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver flask, holding it out to her. Water, and I'll stay right where I am while you decide. After a moment's hesitation, Theo reached for the flask, her parched throat winning over caution. The water was cool and fresh, and she had to stop herself from draining it entirely. What's your name? Preston asked after she'd had her fill. Theodora, she replied, then hesitated before adding Theo. Well, Miss Theo, I don't know what trouble you're in, and I won't ask unless you want to tell me. But I can see you need help, and I was raised to offer it when needed. He stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. My horse is tied up just beyond those trees. If you'll allow it, I can get you to my cabin, tend to that ankle, and you can be on your way when you're ready. Theo looked past him, into the endless expanse of trees. She had no idea which direction led to safety, no way of knowing if her husband was still searching for her. This stranger was offering shelter, at least for a moment, and if he had meant her harm, he could have easily overpowered her already. All right, she said finally, her voice small but determined, but I can't walk far on this ankle. You won't need to, Preston assured her. He whistled, and Rusty bounded to his side. I'll bring my horse here. You sit tight. True to his word, Preston returned minutes later leading a chestnut mare. He approached Theo with the same careful movements, offering his arm for support as she struggled to her feet. This is Belle, he said, patting the horse's neck. She's gentle as they come. Getting Theo onto the horse was a painful process, but Preston was patient, supporting her weight and guiding her movements. Once she was settled in the saddle, he took Belle's reins and began leading them through the woods, Rusty trotting ahead as if showing the way. It's not far, Preston assured her, glancing back to check on her. Just over that ridge, Theo nodded, clutching the saddle horn with white knuckles. Every step of the horse sent jolts of pain through her ankle, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She'd endured worse. Much worse. As they crested the ridge, a small valley opened up before them. A log cabin stood nestled against the tree line, smoke curling from its chimney. A corral contained several horses, and beyond that, she could see cattle grazing in a meadow. Home sweet home, Preston said with a touch of pride. Not much to look at, but it's mine. For a woman who had spent the last 3 years in a grand house that felt like a prison, the modest cabin looked like freedom itself. Preston helped her down from Belle with the same care he'd shown getting her up, supporting her weight as she tested her injured ankle. The pain was sharper now, the joint swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Let's get you inside, he said, concern evident in his voice. That ankle needs looking after. The interior of the cabin was simple but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something bubbling over the flames. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the room, while a bed was tucked into one corner. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and various supplies. Preston helped her to a chair by the fire, then brought over a wooden crate to elevate her injured leg. I need to remove your boot to check that ankle, he said, his hands hovering above her foot. Is that all right? Theo nodded, biting her lip as he carefully unlaced her boot and eased it off. His touch was gentle, clinical, his face a mask of concentration as he examined the swollen joint. Sprained, not broken, I think, he said after a moment. Still, you'll need to stay off it for a few days. I can't, Theo said immediately, panic rising in her chest. I need to keep moving. I need to get further away. Preston looked up at her, his expression serious. Miss Theo, I don't know what you're running from, but you won't get far on that ankle. A few days of rest will do more good than pushing yourself to collapse again. He stood and moved to a cabinet, returning with bandages and a jar of strong-smelling salve. As he knelt to tend to her ankle, he spoke without looking up. "I meant what I said earlier. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but you're safe here, at least for now. I promise you that." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty of it, made Theo's eyes fill with tears. It had been so long since anyone had offered her safety without conditions. "My husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm running from my husband." Preston's hand stilled for just a moment, then continued wrapping her ankle, his movements precise. "He's the one who did this?" he asked, indicating her bruised wrists and the cut on her cheek. Theo nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then you were right to run," Preston said simply. He finished bandaging her ankle and rose to his feet. "You can stay here as long as you need. There's a loft above with a spare bedroll. I'll sleep there. You can take the bed." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Preston interrupted firmly. "Your body needs proper rest to heal." He moved to the fireplace, ladling whatever was in the pot into a wooden bowl. "Rabbit stew," he explained, handing it to her along with a spoon. "Eat, then rest. Everything else can wait." The stew was hearty and flavorful, warming Theo from the inside. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. Preston busied himself around the cabin, feeding Rusty, stoking the fire, seemingly giving her space to eat in peace. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, setting the empty bowl on the table beside her. Preston nodded, taking the bowl and placing it in a basin of water. "Like I said, I was raised to offer help when needed." He paused, considering his next words. "My father wasn't a kind man, especially to my mother, so I recognize the signs." Theo looked down at her hands, at the fading yellow bruises that overlapped with newer purple ones. "Charles wasn't always cruel," she said quietly. "When we first married, he was charming, attentive, but after a while—" She trailed off, unable to articulate how the man she'd thought she loved had transformed into a monster. "You don't need to explain," Preston assured her. "Not to me, not to anyone." He helped her to the bed, placing a pitcher of water and a cup within reach. Before leaving her to rest, he hesitated at the bedside. "Miss Theo," he said, his voice solemn, "I won't let anyone hurt you while you're under my roof. You have my word on that, and when you're healed enough to move on, I'll help you get to wherever you want to go." Theo looked up at this strange, kind man who had found her in the woods and offered shelter without question. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" A sad smile touched Preston's lips. "Because no one did it for my mother when she needed it." He touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of respect. "Rest now. You're safe here." As he turned to leave, Theo caught his sleeve. "Preston," she said, using his name for the first time. "Thank you." He nodded once, then climbed the ladder to the loft, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Despite her fear, despite the pain in her ankle and the uncertainty of her future, Theo felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Small and fragile, but present nonetheless. Outside the cabin window, the Colorado wilderness stretched endlessly, both her escape and her sanctuary. And for the first time since fleeing her husband's rage, Theodora Varley allowed herself to truly rest. Morning light streamed through the cabin's small windows when Theo awoke, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back as she tried to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles and the throbbing in her ankle. The cabin was quiet, but she could see evidence of Preston's morning activities: fresh wood by the fireplace, a kettle of water warming on the hearth, and a clean dress folded on the chair beside the bed. A note rested atop the garment, written in a surprisingly elegant hand: "Gone to check the herd. Back by midday. Rusty is outside. If you need anything, he'll bark to alert me. Rest that ankle. PW. Theo lifted the dress, a simple calico in a soft blue that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. It was clearly too large for her, but leagues better than her torn and muddy garment. Changing was a slow, painful process, but Theo managed it, grateful for the fresh clothes despite the loose fit. She used a length of ribbon she found with the dress to cinch the waist, making it somewhat more manageable. Testing her ankle, she found it still painful but slightly less swollen. Using a chair as a makeshift crutch, she hobbled to the cabin door and pushed it open, blinking in the bright sunlight. Rusty bounded up to greet her, tail wagging furiously. The dog seemed to sense her unsteadiness, staying close as she lowered herself onto the porch step, stretching her injured leg out before her. The view from Preston's cabin was breathtaking. The valley spread out below, ringed by pine-covered mountains. In the distance, she could see the cattle grazing, tiny dark specks against the green meadow. A stream cut through the property, glinting silver in the morning light. It was peaceful in a way Theo had forgotten could exist. No tense silence waiting for the next explosion of rage. No calculating which words might trigger her husband's temper. Just the sound of birdsong, the rustle of leaves, and Rusty's contented panting as he settled beside her. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, absorbing the tranquility, before she spotted a figure on horseback approaching from the meadow. Preston rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, straight-backed but relaxed. He raised a hand in greeting when he saw her on the porch, guiding his horse toward the cabin. "You should be resting that ankle," were his first words as he dismounted, though his tone held no real reproach. "I've been resting since yesterday," Theo replied, "and the fresh air feels good." Preston nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Fair enough, but don't push too hard too fast." He climbed the steps, careful not to jostle her as he passed. "Hungry, I could eat," Theo admitted, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. "Good. I caught some trout this morning before checking the herd." He held the door open for her, offering his arm for support as she struggled to her feet. Rusty darted past them into the cabin, making straight for his water bowl. Inside, Preston moved with efficient ease, preparing the fish and setting a cast iron skillet over the fire. He worked silently for a few minutes before speaking. "Your husband," he said without preamble, keeping his back to her as he tended the cooking fish. "Will he be looking for you?" Theo's hands twisted in her lap. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Charles isn't a man who lets go of what he considers his property easily." Preston nodded, his shoulders tightening slightly. "Is he from St. Joe?" "No, we lived in Denver." She swallowed hard. "Charles Varley. He owns the largest bank in the city. He has connections, people who owe him favors." Preston turned then, his expression grave. "Powerful enemies are the hardest to escape from." "I know," Theo whispered, "but I couldn't stay, not after." She trailed off, the words sticking in her throat. "You don't need to explain," Preston said again, but Theo shook her head. "I do. You've taken me in, risked yourself. You deserve to know." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We had been married 3 years. At first it was just harsh words, criticisms. Then it became shoving, slapping. It got worse over time, but he was always careful. Nothing that would show when we went to social functions." Preston's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "2 months ago, I discovered I was with child." Theo's voice faltered. "Charles was furious. Accused me of trying to trap him, of planning it behind his back. The truth was, I was terrified of bringing a child into that house, but I never said so. That night She closed her eyes against the memory. "He beat me worse than ever before. I lost the baby." The silence that followed was heavy. broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sizzle of the cooking fish. When she opened her eyes, Preston had moved to kneel before her, his face a mask of controlled anger and deep compassion. "I am so sorry, Theodora," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No one should endure such cruelty." Theo nodded, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "After that, something in me changed. I knew I had to leave, or he would eventually kill me. I started hiding away bits of money, planning. 2 nights ago, he came home in a rage over some business deal gone wrong. When he passed out from the whiskey, I took what I'd saved and ran." "You did the right thing," Preston said firmly. "The only thing you could do." "But now I don't know where to go," Theo admitted. "I have some money, but not enough to start over somewhere far away, and Charles won't stop looking. He can't stand the thought of being humiliated by a wife who left him." Preston stood, returning to the fire to remove the skillet. "We'll figure it out," he said simply, as if helping a fugitive wife was an everyday occurrence. "But first, you need to heal, both your ankle and—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing all the invisible wounds she carried. The fish was delicious, seasoned with herbs Preston had growing in small pots on the windowsill. They ate in companionable silence, Rusty watching hopefully from his place by the fire. "How long have you been out here?" Theo asked eventually, curious about this solitary man who had shown her such kindness. 5 years on my own," Preston replied, breaking off a small piece of fish for Rusty. "Worked as a hand on other ranches since I was 14, saved every penny. This land came cheap, too remote for most folks' liking. Don't you get lonely?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Got Rusty, the horses, enough to keep me busy." He shrugged. "Truth is, I prefer the quiet. People in town are decent enough, but I've never been one for crowds." "How far is town from here, St. Joe?" "About half a day's ride. I go in once a month for supplies, mail." Preston studied her face. "You're wondering if your husband might track you there?" Theo nodded, impressed by his perceptiveness. "It's possible," Preston acknowledged. "But St. Joe's a small place, easily overlooked, and folks there mind their own business for the most part." He began clearing away their dishes. "When your ankle's strong enough, we can discuss your options. Until then, you focus on healing." For the next few days, that's exactly what Theo did. She rested her ankle, spending most of her time on the porch, soaking in the peaceful surroundings. Preston went about his daily work tending the cattle, mending fences, hunting, but always returned to check on her, bringing her wildflowers or interesting stones he'd found on his rides. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Preston carved pieces from wood, small animals, mostly, crafted with surprising delicacy for such large hands. They talked of simple things: the weather, the animals, books they'd read. Preston never pressed for more details about her life with Charles, and Theo found herself grateful for his restraint. On the 4th day, Preston returned from checking his traps with a surprise. A walking stick he'd fashioned from a sturdy branch, polished smooth and topped with a carved handle shaped like a bird in flight. "Thought this might help you get around a bit easier," he said, presenting it to her with an almost shy smile. Theo ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, Preston. Thank you." With the aid of the walking stick, Theo was able to venture further from the cabin, though still at a slow pace. Preston walked beside her, patient with her halting progress, ready with a steadying hand when she needed it. Rusty bounded ahead of them, occasionally returning to check their progress as if urging them to hurry. "He's not used to such a leisurely pace," Preston explained with a chuckle. "Usually I'm on horseback or keeping up with him on foot." "I'm slowing you both down," Theo said, feeling a twinge of guilt. "We're in no hurry," Preston assured her. Besides, it's good to take the time to really see the land. I forget that sometimes. They followed the stream that ran near the cabin, Theo marveling at the clarity of the water. Small fish darted beneath the surface, quicksilver flashes in the sunlight. My father used to take me fishing, she said, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. Before he died, I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it. Preston smiled. I can teach you again if you'd like, once your ankle's stronger. The simple offer the assumption that she would still be here when her ankle healed. That there was time for such leisurely activities warmed something inside Theo that had long been cold. As they made their way back to the cabin, slower now as Theo's strength began to wane, Preston pointed out various plants, naming them and explaining their uses. That one there, he said, indicating a small flowering herb, makes a tea good for headaches. And these berries are sweet, but only when they're dark purple. Red ones will give you a stomach ache, something fierce. How did you learn all this? Theo asked, genuinely curious. Some from my mother before she passed. The rest from an old Ute man who used to work at the first ranch I was hired at. He took a shine to me for some reason, taught me things most white folks never bother to learn. Preston's expression grew somber. He died the winter before I bought this place. I named that ridge over there for him Tall Pine Ridge. Theo looked where he pointed, at the distinctive formation silhouetted against the afternoon sky. It's a fine tribute. By the time they reached the cabin, Theo was exhausted but exhilarated. The walk, though short, had been her first taste of freedom without fear since her escape. Preston helped her onto the porch, insisting she rest while he prepared dinner. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Theo found herself studying her rescuer as he moved about the cabin. Preston Wolcott was not a man given to unnecessary words or gestures. Everything about him was straightforward, honest. From the way he spoke to the way he treated his animals, there was a fundamental decency to him that Theo had thought extinct in men. She wondered what circumstances had led him to this solitary existence, why a man with so much to offer would choose to live apart from others. But she didn't ask. Just as he respected her privacy regarding the details of her marriage, she would respect his silence about his past. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a stew made from rabbit and wild onions, Preston cleared his throat in a way that suggested he had something important to say. I need to ride into town tomorrow, he said, setting down his spoon. Running low on some supplies and I should check for mail. I'll be gone most of the day. Theo nodded, trying to hide the flutter of anxiety the news produced. I'll be fine here. Rusty will stay with you, Preston continued. And I'll leave you my pistol. You know how to use one. Theo shook her head. It's simple enough. He reached for the revolver he kept on a high shelf, checking that it was unloaded before handing it to her. Hold it like this, both hands. Sight down the barrel at what you're aiming for. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. He guided her hands into the proper position, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. The weight of the gun was substantial, intimidating. I've never shot anything before, Theo admitted. Hope you won't need to, Preston replied. But better to have it and not need it than the other way around. He took the gun back, loading it carefully before setting it on the table beside her. I doubt anyone will come by. Hardly anyone knows I'm out here, but just in case. Theo appreciated his thoroughness, even as she prayed such precautions would prove unnecessary. The thought of being alone, even for a day, made her nervous, but she knew Preston couldn't put off his trip to town indefinitely on her account. Is there anything you need from town? Preston asked, returning to his stew. I can't promise much. St. Joe's not exactly Denver, but they've got a decent general store. Theo considered. Most of her immediate needs had been met with the dress Preston had provided and the food he shared. Perhaps some thread. "I could mend your shirts while you're gone. I noticed a few need attention." Preston looked surprised, then pleased by the offer. "That'd be kind of you. I'm not much with a needle, more likely to stab myself than fix anything." "It's the least I can do," Theo said sincerely. "You've done so much for me already." "You don't owe me anything," Preston said firmly. "I didn't help you expecting repayment." "I know," Theo replied softly. "That's precisely why I want to help." Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them. Preston was the first to look away, focusing intently on his bowl. "I'll get that thread," he said after a moment, "and maybe some fabric if you'd like to make yourself another dress that actually fits." Theo smiled at the thoughtfulness of the offer. "That would be wonderful, thank you." Later, as she settled into bed and Preston climbed to his loft, Theo found herself less afraid of the coming day alone than she might have expected. In less than a week, this cabin had begun to feel like a sanctuary, and Preston Wolcott had shown her that not all men were like Charles. As she drifted off to sleep, Theo realized with a start that she hadn't thought about her husband all day. It was a small victory, but significant. Perhaps Preston was right, perhaps she could heal here, in this peaceful valley, under the protective gaze of a kind cowboy and his faithful dog. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the first hints of autumn coloring the distant trees. Preston was already up and moving about when Theo awakened, preparing for his journey to town. "I've left food for you and Rusty," he said as she emerged from the bedroom, using her walking stick for support. "Should be back before sunset, but if I'm delayed, don't worry. Sometimes errands take longer than expected." He showed her where everything was water from the pump at the side of the house, extra blankets if the evening grew cool, the rifle above the door in addition to the pistol he'd already given her. "You'll be fine," he assured her, seeing the anxiety she tried to hide. "Rusty's a good guardian, and you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." With those words and a tip of his hat, Preston mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Theo standing on the porch with Rusty at her side. She watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then turned to the dog. "Well, Rusty, looks like it's just us today. What shall we do first?" The dog tilted his head as if considering the question, then trotted into the cabin, returning moments later with one of Preston's shirts in his mouth. Theo laughed, taking the garment from him. "Mending it is, then. You're as practical as your master." The day passed more quickly than Theo had anticipated. She kept herself busy with small tasks, mending Preston's clothes, tidying the already neat cabin, attempting to prepare a decent meal from the provisions he'd left. Her ankle ached less with each passing day, allowing her to move about with greater ease, though she still relied on the walking stick for longer distances. In the afternoon, she ventured to sit by the stream, enjoying the sun on her face as she watched clouds drift overhead. Rusty stayed close, occasionally chasing butterflies but always returning to flop down beside her, his warm presence reassuring. It was there, by the water, that Theo allowed herself to truly consider her future for the first time since her escape. She couldn't stay with Preston indefinitely, it wouldn't be proper, and she had no wish to impose on his solitary life, no matter how kind he'd been. But where could she go? Charles had connections throughout Colorado, and her meager savings wouldn't get her far. She was mulling over these troubling thoughts when Rusty suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he rose to his feet, staring intently at the tree line across the stream. Theo's heart began to race. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, straining to see what had caught the dog's attention. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a movement, a figure on horseback emerging from the trees, moving slowly along the opposite bank. It wasn't Preston. This rider was broader, wearing a dark coat despite the mild weather. Rusty's growl deepened, and Theo placed a restraining hand on his collar, pulling herself to her feet as quietly as possible. She began backing toward the cabin, trying to keep trees between herself and the rider's line of sight. The stranger hadn't appeared to notice her yet, but he was scanning the area with purpose, as if searching for something or someone. Theo's blood ran cold as the rider turned slightly, giving her a clearer view of his face. It wasn't Charles, but she recognized him nonetheless. Martin Greeley, one of her husband's business associates who often did his more unsavory errands. How had he found her? Had someone in St. Joe recognized her description and sent word to Denver? Or had Charles simply sent men searching in every direction, hoping to get lucky? It didn't matter now. What mattered was getting back to the cabin, to the gun Preston had left her before Greeley spotted her. Theo moved as quickly as her injured ankle would allow, Rusty staying protectively at her side. They had nearly reached the cabin when the dog suddenly froze, then darted ahead with a fierce bark. Theo looked up to see another rider approaching from the direction of town, but this one she recognized instantly. "Preston," she called out, relief washing over her. He urged his horse forward at her cry, closing the distance between them quickly. "What's wrong?" he asked, taking in her frightened expression. "A man across the stream," Theo explained hurriedly. "He works for Charles Martin Greeley. He's looking for me, I'm sure of it." Preston's face hardened. Without dismounting, he reached down and extended his hand to her. "Can you get up behind me?" Theo nodded, allowing him to pull her onto the horse behind him, wincing as her ankle protested the sudden movement. "Hold tight," Preston instructed, turning the horse toward the cabin. "Let's get inside before he spots us." They had just reached the porch when a shout came from the direction of the stream. "Wolcott, I know you've got her." Greeley's voice carried clearly across the distance. "Varley's offering a reward for his wife's return. No need for trouble if you hand her over." Preston helped Theo dismount, guiding her quickly into the cabin. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the door. Use the pistol if you need to." "What about you?" Theo asked, clutching his arm. "I'm going to convince Mr. Greeley that continuing his search elsewhere would be in his best interest." The dangerous edge in Preston's normally gentle voice sent a shiver down Theo's spine. "Be careful," she whispered. "Greeley's not a man who gives up easily." Preston's hand covered hers briefly. "Neither am I." Then he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, Theo watched as Preston walked toward the approaching rider, his stance relaxed but alert. Rusty followed at his heels, hackles raised. She reached for the pistol on the table, holding it ready as Preston had shown her, praying she wouldn't need to use it. Greeley halted his horse a short distance from Preston, looking down with undisguised contempt. "Where is she, Wolcott?" "Don't know who you're talking about," Preston replied evenly. "But you're trespassing on my property." Greeley sneered. "Don't play dumb. Theodora Varley. Word in town is you brought in a woman's things yesterday, thread fabric. Since when does a bachelor rancher need such items?" Theo's heart sank. Someone in St. Joe had noticed Preston's purchases and drawn conclusions. Small towns thrived on such observations. "My business is my own," Preston said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "And you still haven't explained why you're on my land." "Charles Varley is a powerful man," Greeley said, ignoring the question. "He wants his wife back. $500 to whoever returns her, no questions asked." "Sounds like a man who lost something that wasn't his to keep," Preston replied. "Now I'll ask you once more to leave my property." Greeley's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Wolcott. Varley won't stop looking, and he's not as polite as I am." "Is that a threat?" Preston's voice remained calm, but Theo could see the tension in his shoulders. "Take it however you want." Greeley shifted in his saddle, his coat falling open to reveal a holstered revolver. "But I'm not leaving without searching your cabin." "Yes, you are." Preston's hand moved to his gun, his stance widening slightly. "Right now." The two men stared at each other, the silence stretching taut between them. Even from a distance, Theo could see the calculation in Greeley's eyes as he weighed his options. Finally, the man spat on the ground. "This isn't over. Varley has friends in high places. You'll regret crossing him." "Already regretting the time I'm wasting talking to you," Preston replied. "Ride out, now." With a final glare, Greeley turned his horse and trotted back toward the stream. Preston didn't move, watching until the rider disappeared into the trees. Only then did he return to the cabin, his face grim. Theo unlocked the door at his knock, relief flooding her at the sight of him unharmed. "He's gone." "For now," Preston confirmed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "But he'll be back, likely with others." "I'm so sorry," Theo whispered, anguish washing over her. "I've brought trouble to your door. I should leave, go somewhere else." "No." Preston's voice was firm. "That's exactly what they want, to frighten you into running, make you an easier target." He took her gently by the shoulders. "We knew this might happen, now we adapt." "How?" Theo asked, fighting back tears of frustration. "Charles won't give up. You heard Greeley, $500 is a fortune. Every desperate man in the territory will be looking for me." Preston guided her to a chair, kneeling before her as he had that first day. "Theodora, listen to me. I made you a promise when I found you in those woods. I said you'd heal here, that I'd help you. I meant it. But this is your home, your life. I can't ask you to risk everything for me. You didn't ask, I offered." His eyes, steady and certain, held hers. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of having you and your mending skills around." The small joke, delivered with such earnestness, brought a reluctant smile to Theo's lips. "My mending skills are worth $500. Worth a good deal more than that, I'd say." Preston stood, his decision clearly made. "We'll need to be more careful, limit trips to town, maybe spread some misinformation when I do go in." "What kind of misinformation?" Theo asked, intrigued despite her worry. "Oh, perhaps mention I've hired a widow from Kansas as a housekeeper. Or that my cousin's wife is visiting from Texas." Preston's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. "People love to gossip. Might as well give them something to talk about that throws Greeley off your scent." The cleverness of the plan impressed Theo. "You've done this before, haven't you?" "Misdirection." Preston shrugged. "Let's just say I've had some practice staying under the notice of certain parties." He didn't elaborate, and Theo didn't press, recognizing another piece of his mysterious past. "Now," Preston said, changing the subject, "I believe I promised you thread and fabric." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "The general store didn't have much selection, but Mrs. Peterson helped me choose." Theo unwrapped the package to find several spools of sturdy thread in practical colors. A packet of needles and lengths of fabric, one a serviceable brown cotton, the other a surprisingly pretty blue calico with tiny white flowers. "Preston, this is." She ran her fingers over the blue fabric, touched by his thoughtfulness. "This must have cost." "Don't worry about the cost," he interrupted gently. "Consider it payment for all the mending." Theo knew it was far more than that. It was a gesture of support, of commitment to her safety. And something else, perhaps, something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," she said simply, hoping he could hear all the words she couldn't say. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We should eat. Then we'll make plans for what comes next." As they prepared dinner together, Moving around each other in the small cabin with growing familiarity, Theo felt a curious sense of peace, despite the danger revealed by Greeley's visit. For the first time since fleeing Denver, she had an ally in her fight, someone who believed her, who valued her safety above convenience or reward. And for the first time in years, Theodora Varley felt the stirrings of something she'd thought lost forever: hope for a future free from fear. The following week brought changes to the peaceful routine Theo and Preston had established. No longer did they venture far from the cabin together. Instead, Preston taught Theo to shoot the pistol he'd given her, standing behind her to adjust her aim, his hands steady on her shoulders. "You're a natural," he said approvingly as she hit the tin can he'd set up on a fence post 20 paces away. Theo lowered the gun, surprised by her own accuracy. "I never thought I'd be comfortable with a weapon. It's a tool like any other," Preston replied. "In the right hands, it protects more than it harms." They began taking other precautions as well. Preston rode the boundaries of his property each morning and evening, checking for signs of intruders. Rusty was now a constant sentinel, alert to any unusual sounds or smells. And Theo found herself watching the horizon, scanning for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. Despite these necessary adjustments, life at the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Theo's ankle continued to heal, allowing her to help more with daily chores. She discovered she enjoyed cooking, experimenting with the simple ingredients available to create meals that brought a smile to Preston's face. With the fabric he'd bought her, she sewed herself a new dress that actually fit, as well as an apron to protect it during her work. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking more freely now about their pasts. Theo spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her father's shipping business. The dreams she'd had before marriage to Charles had narrowed her world to the confines of their Denver mansion. "I wanted to be a teacher," she confessed one night as Preston whittled a new figure, a fox, its tail curling elegantly. "I even had a position arranged at a girls' school in Boston. But then my father died, leaving debts we hadn't known about. Charles seemed like salvation at the time, wealthy, charming, offering security when we had none." "You couldn't have known what he would become," Preston said, his eyes on his carving. "Perhaps I should have," Theo sighed. "There were signs, even during our courtship, the way he spoke to servants. His temper when contradicted, but I was young and afraid of poverty." "Fear makes reasonable people do unreasonable things," Preston observed. "Can't blame yourself for that." His understanding, free of judgment, allowed Theo to speak of things she'd never shared with anyone. The gradual erosion of her confidence under Charles's criticism. The isolation as he systematically cut her off from friends and family. The terror of living with a man whose rage could be triggered by something as simple as a meal served too cold or a comment deemed too forward. In turn, Preston began sharing pieces of his own history, though he remained more reticent than Theo. She learned that his father had been a drunkard who abandoned the family when Preston was 12, leaving him and his mother to fend for themselves on their small Illinois farm. "She worked herself to death, essentially," Preston said, his voice matter of fact but his hands stilling on his carving. "Taking in laundry, sewing, whatever would put food on the table. She died when I was 14. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but really it was exhaustion." "I'm so sorry," Theo said softly, understanding now his fierce protectiveness, his instinctive response to her plight. Preston nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "After she passed, I headed west, worked ranches in Kansas, Wyoming, finally Colorado, saved every penny." A small smile touched his lips. "She would have liked this place, I think. The quiet, the mountains." "She would be proud of you," Theo said with certainty. "The man you've become." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. He returned to his carving, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with growing understanding. Days passed without sign of Greeley or other searchers. True to his word, Preston had ridden into town once, deliberately mentioning to the gossip-prone shopkeeper that his widowed sister from Kansas City might be coming to stay, as she'd recently lost her husband and needed a change of scenery. "That should keep them guessing," he said with satisfaction upon his return, "especially since I don't have a sister." Theo laughed, a sound that came more easily to her now. "You're becoming quite the strategic thinker, Mr. Wolcott." "Just adapting to circumstances, Miss Theo," he replied with a wink that sent an unexpected warmth through her. October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and more vibrant colors to the valley. Theo's ankle had healed enough that she no longer needed the walking stick, though Preston had insisted she keep it as a memento of our first meeting. She treasured it as she did the small wooden animals he carved for her: a deer, an owl, a rabbit, each one appearing mysteriously on her pillow or beside her breakfast plate. One crisp morning, as frost sparkled on the grass outside the cabin, Preston approached Theo with an unusually serious expression. "I need to ride into St. Joe today," he said as they cleared away breakfast dishes. "Running low on supplies, and there's something else I need to take care of." Theo nodded, tamping down the flutter of anxiety that still arose whenever he mentioned leaving. "I'll be fine here with Rusty. Actually," Preston said, hesitating slightly, "I was hoping you might come with me this time." Surprise rendered Theo momentarily speechless. "To town." "But what about Greeley? The reward?" "It's been almost 3 weeks with no sign of him," Preston reasoned. "And you can't stay hidden forever. Besides, I have an idea that might help, but I need you with me to make it work." "What kind of idea?" Theo asked, both curious and wary. "A way to give you a new identity of sorts." Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew something small that glinted in the morning light, a simple gold ring. "If you were to come to town as my wife, no one would be looking for Theodora Varley. They'd see only Mrs. Wolcott." The proposal for that was what it was, however practical its framing left Theo breathless. "Preston, that would be just for appearances," he added quickly, misreading her hesitation. "A way to protect you while giving you more freedom to move about. You wouldn't have to stay hidden here at the cabin all the time." "Where did you get the ring?" Theo asked, her mind latching onto this detail rather than addressing the larger question. A shadow passed over Preston's face. "It was my mother's. Only thing of value she kept when times got hard. I've carried it with me since she died." The significance of this offering wasn't lost on Theo. That he would share this precious connection to his mother, even for a practical deception, spoke volumes. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, searching his face. "Claiming me as your wife could bring Charles's vengeance down on you even more directly." "I'm certain that I want you safe," Preston replied simply, "and free to live without looking over your shoulder constantly." His steady gaze held hers. "The rest we can figure out as we go." The practicality of the plan was undeniable. As Theodora Varley, she was a fugitive with a price on her head. As Mrs. Wolcott, she would become invisible to those searching for a runaway wife. "All right," she said finally, extending her left hand. "For appearances." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, the simple band a perfect fit. His hand lingered on hers for a moment, warm and steady. "Thank you for trusting me," he said quietly. "You've given me every reason to," Theo replied with equal softness. They rode into St. Joe together an hour later, Theo seated behind Preston on Bell, her arms around his waist for stability. She wore her new blue dress with a shawl Preston had procured from somewhere, her hair neatly braided and pinned beneath a bonnet. The ring on her finger caught the morning light as they approached the small town nestled in the valley below. St. Joe wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a small church, a handful of houses, and a livery stable. But to Theo, who had seen nothing but Preston's cabin and the surrounding wilderness for nearly a month, it seemed bustling with activity. "Stay close," Preston murmured as they dismounted in front of the general store. "Most folks here are decent, but word travels fast." Theo nodded, suddenly nervous as several townspeople turned to look at them with undisguised curiosity. Preston placed a protective hand at the small of her back, guiding her toward the store. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, drawing the attention of the plump, gray-haired woman behind the counter. Her eyes widened at the sight of Theo, then flickered to Preston with obvious interest. "Preston Wolcott as I live and breathe," she said, setting aside the ledger she'd been writing in. "And with company, no less." "Morning, Mrs. Peterson," Preston replied, removing his hat. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Theodora." The woman's eyebrows shot up nearly to her hairline. "Wife? When did this happen? You weren't even courting anyone last I heard." "It was a quick courtship," Preston said smoothly. "Theo and I knew each other years ago in Kansas, reconnected this summer when I was visiting my old ranch. Sometimes you just know right away when something's meant to be." Theo marveled at the ease with which he crafted this fiction, layering it with just enough truth, her name, Kansas, to make it believable. "Well, I never," Mrs. Peterson said, coming around the counter to inspect Theo more closely. "You've been holding out on us, Preston Wolcott. And such a pretty bride, too." She took Theo's hands in her own. "Welcome to St. Joe, Mrs. Wolcott. I'm Edith Peterson. My husband Harold and I run the store." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Peterson," Theo replied, summoning the social graces that had once been second nature in Denver society. "Preston speaks highly of your establishment." This simple compliment seemed to win the older woman over completely. "Well, aren't you sweet? And after being stuck out at that lonely cabin all this time. Preston, you should have brought her in sooner. We've been settling in," Preston said, the faintest flush coloring his cheeks. Mrs. Peterson winked knowingly. "Newlyweds. I remember those days." She turned back to Theo. "You must join us for Sunday services. The whole town will want to meet Preston's bride." "That's very kind," Theo said, feeling a pang of guilt at the genuine welcome being extended to her under false pretenses. "Perhaps when we're more settled." Preston squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We should get our supplies, darling. Don't want to take up too much of Mrs. Peterson's time." The endearment, though part of their charade, sent a warm flutter through Theo's chest. They moved through the store together, selecting the items from Preston's list, adding a few small luxuries that caught Theo's eye: real coffee, a bar of lavender soap, a tin of hard candies. Mrs. Peterson chattered the entire time, filling them in on town gossip and asking gentle but probing questions about their courtship and wedding. Preston fielded these with surprising ease, constructing a plausible history for them that Theo carefully committed to memory. "And you're lucky you weren't here a few weeks back," Mrs. Peterson said as she wrapped their purchases in brown paper. "Had a nasty character asking about a runaway wife, said she might be in these parts." Theo froze, but Preston's hand on her arm steadied her. "Oh," he said casually. "What became of that?" Mrs. Peterson sniffed disapprovingly. "Sheriff Daniels sent him on his way. Said we don't hold with men who chase their wives off, then hunt them down like animals." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think the sheriff recognized the man's description of his wife. Matches a case he heard about over in Denver, banker whose wife disappeared after he beat her so bad she lost a baby." The directness of this statement shocked Theo, but Mrs. Peterson didn't notice, continuing in the same gossipy tone. Anyway, the sheriff told him he'd seen no such woman and suggested he try Utah. Said Mormon country might be more sympathetic to his views on wifely obedience. She chuckled at this. That sent him packing quick enough. Relief washed over Theo. Not only was Greeley gone, but it seemed the local law was unlikely to cooperate with Charles's search. Preston's strategy of bringing her into town openly as his wife suddenly seemed even more brilliant. They finished their transactions, loaded their supplies onto Belle, and bid Mrs. Peterson farewell, promising to consider her invitation to Sunday services. As they prepared to mount up for the ride home, Preston paused, studying Theo's face. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "How are you feeling?" Theo considered the question honestly. Relieved, grateful, a bit guilty for the deception, but she touched the ring on her finger. "It feels good to be someone other than Theodora Varley, hunted wife." Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "For what it's worth, you make a very convincing Mrs. Wolcott." Something in his tone made Theo look up sharply, searching his face for the meaning behind the words. But Preston had already turned away, adjusting Belle's saddle before helping Theo mount. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The success of their ruse in town had opened new possibilities. Theo might be able to move about more freely, build something resembling a normal life. But it had also complicated the already complex relationship between them. Playing the role of Preston's wife, even briefly, had felt disturbingly natural. The casual touches, the terms of endearment, the shared smiles at Mrs. Peterson's assumptions all had come easily, as if they'd been practicing for years rather than hours. And therein lay the danger. Theo wasn't free to explore these feelings, not with Charles still hunting for her, not with the uncertainty of her future hanging over them both. And Preston deserved better than a woman whose past might destroy them both. Yet as they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Theo couldn't help but tighten her arms around Preston's waist, leaning into the solid warmth of him. Whatever complications tomorrow might bring, today they had created a small victory, a glimpse of what freedom might look like. And for now, that was enough. The successful visit to St. Joe marked a turning point in Theo and Preston's coexistence. The pretense of marriage, initially a practical solution to a dangerous problem, began to blur the boundaries between them in subtle ways. Preston no longer slept in the loft, instead making a bedroll near the fire each night, claiming the change was for convenience rather than propriety. Theo found herself growing accustomed to the comfortable domesticity of their arrangement, preparing meals together, sharing the evening's last cup of coffee, discussing the day's events as if they truly were partners in life as well as in deception. They returned to town together twice more in the following weeks, each visit reinforcing their story as newlyweds. Mrs. Peterson introduced them to other townspeople, all of whom welcomed Mrs. Wolcott with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. The sheriff, a taciturn man named Daniel Everett, had given Preston a knowing look during their second visit, but said nothing beyond a polite greeting. "He suspects something," Theo said as they rode home after that encounter. "The sheriff, I mean." Preston nodded, seemingly unconcerned. "Daniels is sharp, but he's also fair. If he hasn't said anything by now, I don't think he means to." This assessment proved accurate. During their third visit to St. Joe, Sheriff Everett approached them as they loaded supplies onto Belle. "Wolcott," he said with a nod. "Madam." He tipped his hat to Theo. "Fine day." "Sheriff," Preston acknowledged, his posture relaxed but alert. "Something we can help you with." The lawman glanced around, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "Just wanted you to know, had another visitor asking about a woman matching your wife's description." His emphasis on the word wife was subtle but unmistakable. "Told him same as the last, haven't seen hide nor hair of any runaways." Theo's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral, grateful for the steady pressure of Preston's hand at her waist. "Appreciate the information, Sheriff," Preston said evenly. "Any idea which way this visitor was headed after leaving town?" "Said something about checking mining camps to the north." Sheriff Everett studied Theo's face for a moment. "Seems mighty persistent for a man who supposedly wants to reconcile with his wife." "Some men confuse possession with love," Theo said, finding her voice at last. The sheriff nodded slowly. "That they do, madam, that they do." He adjusted his hat. "Weather's turning. Passes will be snowed in soon. Hard to travel these parts in winter." "Good thing we're well stocked for the season," Preston replied, understanding the implicit message. "Indeed." Sheriff Everett touched his hat brim again. "Good day to you both." As they rode away, Theo released a shaky breath. He knows enough," Preston agreed, "and he's chosen his side." He glanced back at her, his expression serious. "Sheriff's right about one thing, winter's coming. Charles's men will have a hard time searching these mountains once the snow flies." The first snow came in mid-November, transforming the valley into a wonderland of white. Preston had spent the preceding weeks preparing, chopping extra firewood, smoking meat, making sure the cabin was sealed against drafts. Theo had contributed by canning the last of the garden vegetables and mending their warmest clothes. They settled into a winter routine, cozy despite the isolation. Preston still rode out daily to check his cattle, now gathered in the sheltered southern pasture, but he never stayed away long. Trips to town became less frequent as the weather grew harsher, but they made one final journey in early December to stock up on supplies and send a telegram Preston insisted was necessary. "Who are you telegraphing?" Theo asked as they left the small office adjacent to the general store. "An old friend in Denver," Preston replied, offering no further explanation. "Just taking some precautions." Theo wanted to press for details but held her tongue. Preston had earned her trust many times over, and if he felt this telegram was important, she would accept his judgment. The winter deepened, blanketing the valley in snow that often reached the lower windows of the cabin. They were truly isolated now, with even St. Joe several hours' difficult journey away. Yet Theo found herself more content than fearful. The cabin was warm, their supplies ample, and Preston's company increasingly essential to her happiness. In the evenings, they would read aloud from Preston's small collection of books, mostly practical manuals, but also a volume of Tennyson's poetry that had belonged to his mother, and a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. Sometimes Preston would play his harmonica, simple tunes that filled the cabin with a melancholy sweetness. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside and the fire crackling cheerfully, that the fragile equilibrium between them finally shifted. Preston had been teaching Theo to play checkers, his patience endless as she struggled to grasp the strategy. When she finally won a game fairly, not through his deliberate mistakes, her delighted laugh triggered something neither of them had fully acknowledged. "You're beautiful when you laugh like that," Preston said, the words seemingly escaping before he could consider them. Theo's smile faltered, not from displeasure but from the sudden intensity of his gaze. "Preston." "I'm sorry," he said immediately, pushing back from the table. "That was inappropriate." "No," Theo said quickly, reaching across to catch his hand. "It wasn't inappropriate, it was kind." Preston looked down at their joined hands. "Kind isn't what I'm feeling, Theo." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch, and that's the problem. The tension between them, carefully managed for weeks, suddenly filled the small cabin. Theo knew she should let go of his hand, maintain the boundaries that protected them both. Instead, she tightened her grip. "What are you feeling?" she asked softly. Preston's eyes, when they met hers, held a vulnerability she'd never seen in him before. "Things I have no right to feel. You're still married, still in danger, still healing from what that monster did to you." "Yes," Theo acknowledged. "All of that is true, but that doesn't answer my question." For a long moment, Preston was silent, the only sound in the cabin the popping of the fire and their own measured breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "I'm feeling that I want this pretend marriage to be real. That I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be there. That watching you heal, seeing you grow stronger each day, has been the greatest privilege of my life." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm feeling that I love you, Theodora Varley, and that I would spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you if you'd let me." The declaration, so honest and unadorned, brought tears to Theo's eyes. "Preston," a sharp bark from Rusty interrupted whatever she might have said. The dog was at the window, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. Preston was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with a fluid grace that belied his size. He peered out into the darkness, his body tensing. "What is it?" Theo asked, fear replacing the warmth of moments before. "Riders," Preston said grimly, "3 of them coming up the valley." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "Get your coat and boots. Now." Theo didn't question, moving quickly to gather warm clothing while Preston grabbed his rifle and loaded it with practiced efficiency. "Where are we going?" she asked as she pulled on the heavy coat Preston had procured for her from town. "Root cellar out back," he replied, gathering ammunition from a box on the high shelf. "It's concealed, stocked with supplies. You'll be safe there while I deal with our visitors." "No," Theo said firmly. "I'm not hiding while you face them alone." Preston turned to her, his expression softening despite the urgency of the moment. "Theo, please. These men are dangerous. If anything happened to you, and if anything happened to you while I cowered in a cellar, I couldn't live with myself." She reached for the pistol he had given her, checking it as he had taught her. "We face this together." For a second, Theo thought he might argue further. Instead, Preston nodded, a fierce pride in his eyes. "Together, then. But we do this my way." He moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace, prying it up to reveal a small compartment. From it, he withdrew a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Get behind the table. Wait for my signal." Theo positioned herself as directed, watching as Preston unwrapped the package to reveal a second pistol, which he checked with the same care he'd shown his rifle. He stationed himself by the window, Rusty at his heels, both of them alert and ready. The approaching riders were visible now in the moonlight reflected off the snow-dark silhouettes against the white landscape. They slowed as they neared the cabin, spreading out to approach from different angles. "They're being cautious," Preston murmured. "Smart. But it means they're expecting trouble." "Is it Charles?" Theo asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Preston shook his head. "Can't tell from here. Stay low." The riders halted about 50 yards from the cabin. One of them called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "Wolcott, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and we'll leave you be." Preston's jaw tightened. "Not Charles," he confirmed, "but definitely his men." He raised his voice to respond. "You're trespassing on private property. Ride away now and no one needs to get hurt." A harsh laugh answered him. "Don't be a fool, rancher. Varley's offering $1,000 now for his wife's return. Why die for a woman who isn't even yours?" The price had doubled since Greeley's visit. Charles's desperation or his rage must be growing. "Last warning," Preston called back. "Leave now." Instead of responding, one of the riders fired a shot that splintered the wood beside the window. Preston ducked, then returned fire with his rifle, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Outside, a horse reared, its rider struggling to maintain control. "They'll try to rush the cabin from different directions," Preston said, ejecting the spent cartridge and loading another. "When I give the word, shoot at anything that moves near the east window. Don't aim to kill, just keep them back." Theo nodded, her hand surprisingly steady as she gripped the pistol. The fear was still there, but something else had joined it: determination and a fierce protectiveness toward the man beside her. The next minutes unfolded in a blur of noise and movement. The riders attempted to approach the cabin from multiple angles, using the cover of darkness and the scattered trees. Preston moved between windows with remarkable agility, firing at strategic moments to force their retreat. Theo followed his instructions, discharging her pistol when directed, the recoil jarring her arms but her aim true enough to keep the attackers at bay. "They're regrouping," Preston said after a lull in the gunfire. "Probably deciding if you're worth dying for." As if in answer to this assessment, a new voice called from the darkness, one that sent ice through Theo's veins. "Theodora." "This has gone on long enough." Charles Varley's distinctive tenor, cultured and controlled despite the circumstances, was unmistakable. "Come out now and I'll spare your protector." Theo rose from her position, instinctively moving toward the door, but Preston caught her arm. "Don't," he whispered fiercely. "It's a trick. He has no intention of leaving either of us alive." "He's here, Preston," Theo replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Charles himself. He never dirties his own hands if he's here." "Then he's desperate," Preston finished, "which makes him more dangerous, not less." He held her gaze intently. "Trust me, Theo, please." She nodded, forcing herself to breathe deeply, to think past the paralyzing fear that Charles's voice had triggered. "What do we do?" Preston's eyes narrowed as he considered their options. "We need to get to the barn. There's a back trail that leads into the high country, if we can reach it." He was interrupted by a shattering sound as something came crashing through the window, a flaming torch that landed on the rug near the bed. Flames leapt up immediately, catching on the dry fabric. "They're trying to smoke us out," Preston said grimly, moving to stamp out the fire before it could spread. Another torch followed, this one landing dangerously close to the stored ammunition. "Preston," Theo cried in warning. He turned, saw the danger, and kicked the torch back through the broken window in one fluid motion. A pained shout from outside suggested it had found a target. "Now's our chance," Preston said, grabbing his coat and a small pack that Theo hadn't noticed him preparing. "Out the back, quick and quiet. Stay low." They slipped through the rear door of the cabin, Rusty following silently at their heels. The cold hit Theo like a physical blow after the warmth of the cabin, but she pushed through it, focusing on following Preston's sure movements through the snow. They had almost reached the barn when a shot rang out, the bullet hitting the snow near Theo's feet. She stumbled, and Preston immediately pulled her behind the shelter of a water trough. "Run for the barn," he instructed, raising his rifle. "I'll cover you." "Not without you," Theo insisted, clutching his arm. The affection in Preston's eyes was almost unbearable. "Together then, on my count. 1, 2, 3. They sprinted for the barn door, Preston keeping his body between Theo and the direction of the shot. More gunfire followed, but their attackers were firing blind in the darkness, the shots going wide. Inside the barn, Preston moved with purpose, saddling Belle with swift efficiency while Theo kept watch at the door. Rusty prowled the perimeter, growling softly at any sound from outside. "They'll figure out where we've gone soon enough," Preston said, securing the pack to the saddle. "We need to be well away by then." He helped Theo mount, then swung up behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. "What about Rusty?" Theo asked, unwilling to leave the faithful dog behind. "He'll follow," Preston assured her. "He knows these mountains as well as I do." With that, they burst from the barn, Preston guiding Belle toward a narrow path that led away from the cabin, up into the forested slopes beyond. Shouts and gunfire erupted behind them, but they were already disappearing into the trees, the darkness and the terrain their allies now. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the path climbing steadily into the mountains. The snow deepened, slowing their progress, but Belle was sure-footed and Preston's knowledge of the trail unwavering. Rusty bounded alongside them, occasionally ranging ahead as if scouting the way. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached a small clearing where the remains of an old trapper's cabin stood little more than stone walls and a partially collapsed roof, but shelter nonetheless. "We can rest here for a few hours," Preston said as they dismounted. "They won't be able to follow our trail easily in the dark, and the snow will slow them down." Theo was shivering violently now, the cold and fear and exertion taking their toll. Preston led her into the shelter of the ruined cabin, where he quickly set about building a small, smokeless fire using supplies from his pack. Soon, a modest flame provided enough warmth to ease the worst of the chill. "You're prepared for this," Theo observed as Preston produced a small pot and began melting snow for coffee. "You expected we might have to run." Preston nodded, not looking up from his task. "I've always had contingency plans. Living alone in these mountains, you learn to anticipate trouble." He glanced at her then, his expression somber. "But I didn't expect Charles to come himself. That complicates things." "He won't give up," Theo said, the reality of their situation settling heavily upon her. "We'll have to keep running." "Not necessarily." Preston handed her a cup of strong, hot coffee. "The telegram I sent from town last month. It was to a lawyer I know in Denver. Man named Michael Holloway. He specializes in difficult cases." Theo stared at him in confusion. "A lawyer? What can a lawyer do against Charles?" "He owns half the judges in Colorado." "Not all of them," Preston replied. "And Holloway has evidence against your husband that goes beyond your situation. Apparently, Charles Varley's banking practices have caught the attention of federal investigators. Holloway was building a case when you ran. He thinks your testimony could be the final piece they need." This revelation stunned Theo. "How do you know all this?" Preston sipped his coffee before answering. "Holloway and I have history. He helped me with a legal matter years ago. When I realized who your husband was, I reached out. And this lawyer believes he can bring Charles down. Legally, he believes with your testimony, Charles could face federal charges for fraud in addition to state charges for what he did to you." Preston's eyes were steady on hers. "It would mean going back to Denver, Theo, facing him in court." "I wouldn't ask that of you if I thought there was another way." Theo absorbed this information slowly, considering the implications. For months, she had been running, hiding, surviving. The thought of confronting Charles, of standing before him and speaking the truth about what he had done, was terrifying. But the alternative, a lifetime of looking over her shoulder, of putting Preston in danger, was unthinkable. "If I did this," she said carefully, "would you come with me?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Preston replied, his voice fierce with conviction. "But Theo, you should know Holloway warned that it won't be easy. Charles will fight. He'll try to discredit you, paint you as unstable or unfaithful." "Let him try," Theo said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I have the truth on my side, and I have you." Preston reached across the small space between them, taking her hand in his. "Always," he promised. "But first, we need to get through the next few days. Charles and his men will be searching these mountains, and we need to stay ahead of them until we can reach Holloway in Denver." "What's your plan?" Theo asked, drawing strength from his confidence. "There's an old mining road that connects to the stage route about 15 miles from here," Preston explained. "If we can reach it by tomorrow night, we can catch the eastbound stage to Denver the following morning. Charles will be looking for us heading west or north, away from the city." The logic was sound, if daring. By heading back toward Denver, the very place Charles would least expect Theo to go, they might slip past his search parties. "Will Rusty be all right?" Theo asked, watching as the dog patrolled the perimeter of their shelter. "And Belle?" Preston smiled at her concern. "Belle will carry us to the stage road, then make her way home. She's done it before. And Rusty." He glanced at the dog with affection. "He'll either come with us to Denver or return to the ranch. He's smarter than most people I know." They rested for several hours, taking turns keeping watch while the other slept fitfully on the hard ground. By midday, they were on the move again, following a game trail that wound through dense forest, occasionally breaking into clearings that offered glimpses of the valleys below. From one such vantage point, Preston pointed out a plume of smoke rising from the direction of his cabin. "They've burned it," he said, his voice tight with anger but not surprise. "Trying to flush us out, or maybe just spite." Theo's heart ached for him. "Preston, I'm so sorry. You're home." He shook his head, cutting off her apology. "It's just wood and nails, can be rebuilt." His eyes met hers, unwavering. "What matters is that you're safe." They continued their journey through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only when darkness made further travel dangerous. They made camp beneath a rocky overhang that provided some shelter from the wind, eating sparingly from Preston's supplies and keeping the fire small and well hidden. As night deepened around them, Theo found herself studying Preston's face in the flickering firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, all had become dear to her in ways she was only now beginning to fully acknowledge. "You're staring," Preston observed quietly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm memorizing," Theo corrected, "in case." She couldn't finish the thought. Preston moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "There's no in case, Theo. We're going to make it through this." "How can you be so certain?" she asked, leaning into his solid warmth. "Charles has money, men, influence. We have each other," Preston finished. "And that's not nothing." He hesitated, then added softly, "I meant what I said back at the cabin before we were interrupted. I love you, Theodora. Have since I found you in those woods, I think. Whatever happens in Denver, that won't change." Theo turned to face him fully, her heart pounding. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and freeing. "I think I've known it for weeks, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. Afraid of what it might mean, of what Charles might do if he found out." "He has no power over your heart," Preston said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Not anymore." In the cold of the mountain night, with danger still pursuing them and an uncertain future ahead, Theo felt a warmth bloom within her that had nothing to do with the small fire. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to Preston's. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them aware of the precipice they stood upon. Then Preston's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more honest. It was a promise, a declaration, a defiance against all that had tried to break them. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed despite the cold, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he murmured, "when you're legally free, I'm going to ask you properly to be my wife. Not for pretend, not for protection, but because I want to build a life with you, Theodora Varley." Tears pricked at Theo's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so fierce it was almost painful. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." They held each other through the night, finding comfort in the simple proximity of heartbeats, the synchronization of breaths. Whatever trials awaited them in Denver, they would face them together, no longer a woman fleeing alone and the cowboy who had found her, but partners, equals, bound by choice rather than circumstance. Morning brought renewed purpose and a clearer path forward. They broke camp early, continuing their journey toward the mining road that would lead them to the stage route. The weather held, the sky a brilliant blue above the snow-covered pines, as if nature itself approved their decision. By late afternoon, they reached the abandoned mining road, its rutted surface partially visible beneath the snow. Preston's relief was palpable as he helped Theo dismount from Belle. "We've made good time," he said, checking the position of the sun. "The stage stop is about 5 miles down this road. We should reach it before nightfall, find a place to rest, and be ready for the morning stage." Theo nodded, stretching her legs after the long ride. "Will Charles have men watching the stage?" "Possibly," Preston acknowledged. "But I doubt he's had time to organize a thorough search of all routes. And he'll be looking for a woman traveling alone, not a couple." He reached into his pack and withdrew a folded piece of fabric, which he shook out to reveal a plain but respectable dress. "Bought this in St. Joe during our last visit, just in case. It's not fancy, but it's clean and proper for traveling." Touched by his foresight, Theo took the garment. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Preston admitted with a rueful smile, "but I'm trying my best." They continued down the mining road, leading Belle rather than riding her, both to rest the horse and to maintain a lower profile as they approached more traveled areas. Rusty ranged ahead, occasionally returning to check on them, his manner alert but not alarmed. The stage stop proved to be a small settlement consisting of a rough tavern, a stable, and a few scattered cabins. Preston approached cautiously, surveying the area for any sign of Charles's men before leading Theo toward the tavern. "Keep your head down," he murmured as they neared the building. "Let me do the talking." Inside, the tavern was sparsely populated, a few local miners, the bartender, and an older couple who appeared to be travelers waiting for the stage. Preston secured them a small room for the night, paying extra for a hot meal and bath water to be brought up. Once alone in the simple room, with its narrow bed and single window overlooking the stables, Theo felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. They had made it this far without detection. Denver was just a day's journey away. Perhaps Holloway truly could help her break free from Charles legally, permanently. "You should rest," Preston said, watching her with concern. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Theo nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, not just physically, but emotionally. The constant vigilance, the fear, the desperate flight through the mountains had taken their toll. "What about you?" she asked, noting the shadows beneath Preston's eyes. "I'll keep watch for a while," he replied. "Make sure we weren't followed." Though she wanted to protest, to insist he rest as well, Theo recognized the practicality of his decision. Instead, she crossed to where he stood by the window and wrapped her arms around his waist, leaning into the solid strength of him. "Wake me in a few hours," she said. "You need sleep too." Preston pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I will. Now rest, love." The endearment, spoken so naturally, warmed her heart. She settled onto the bed, watching through half-closed eyes as Preston positioned himself by the window, his profile strong and vigilant against the gathering dusk. Despite the danger still pursuing them, Theo felt safer than she had in years. Sleep claimed her quickly, deep and dreamless. When she awoke, the room was dark save for a single candle burning low on the table. Preston was dozing in the chair by the window, his head resting against the wall, one hand still near his holstered gun. Careful not to wake him, Theo rose and moved to the window, peering out at the quiet settlement below. The moon illuminated the empty street, the stable where Belle had been housed for the night, the surrounding forest that seemed to press in on the small clearing. No sign of pursuit, no indication of danger. Still, a sense of unease prickled at the base of her neck. Something had awakened her, some sound or presence that her conscious mind hadn't registered. She strained to hear beyond the creaking of the old building, the distant murmur of voices from the tavern below, there a soft whine, barely audible. Rusty. Preston had left the dog outside to serve as an early warning system, his keen senses more reliable than any human guard. Moving carefully to Preston's side, Theo touched his shoulder gently. "Preston," she whispered, "wake up." He was instantly alert, hand moving to his gun before his eyes were fully open. "What is it?" "Rusty," Theo said, nodding toward the window. "He's signaling." Preston was on his feet in one fluid motion, joining her at the window. For a long moment, they both scanned the darkness below, seeing nothing amiss. Then a shadow detached itself from the tree line, a figure moving stealthily toward the stable. "One of Charles's men?" Theo asked, her heart beginning to race. "Or just a traveler," Preston replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Either way, we should be ready to move." They gathered their few belongings quickly, Preston checking his weapons while Theo changed into the traveling dress he had provided. They were nearly ready when a soft scratching at the door froze them both. Preston motioned for Theo to stand behind him as he approached the door, gun drawn. "Who's there?" he called softly. A familiar whine answered him. "Rusty." Preston opened the door just enough for the dog to slip through, then quickly secured it again. Rusty went straight to Theo, pressing against her legs in a protective gesture. "Something spooked him," Preston observed, concern darkening his features. "We need to leave. Now." "The stage doesn't depart until morning," Theo reminded him, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We're not waiting for the stage." Preston peered out the window once more, his expression grim. "There's more movement out there, at least 3 men spreading out around the building." Cold fear gripped Theo. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter now," Preston replied. "What matters is getting away." He turned to face her fully, his eyes intense. "There's a back staircase leads to the kitchen. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to slip into the forest behind the tavern." "And then?" Theo asked, clutching her small bundle of belongings. "There's a settlement about 10 miles east, larger than this place, with a sheriff's office. If we can reach it, we can telegraph Holloway, get his help." It wasn't an ideal plan, but it was the only one they had. With a deep breath, Theo nodded her readiness. Preston checked the hallway, then motioned for her to follow, Rusty padding silently at their heels. They made it down the back staircase without incident, but as they reached the kitchen, voices from the main room of the tavern made them freeze. Charles's cultured tones carried clearly through the thin wall. Significant reward for information leading to their capture. "My wife is unwell, you understand. Ran away during an episode of hysteria. The man with her is taking advantage of her condition." The barkeep's response was too low to hear, but Charles's reply was sharp with irritation. "Of course they've been here. The stable boy already identified their horse. Now, are they still in the building or have they moved on?" Preston's hand tightened on Theo's arm, urging her toward the back door. They slipped out into the cold night air just as footsteps approached the kitchen. Rusty following like a shadow. The area behind the tavern was cluttered with barrels, firewood, and various supplies, providing some cover as they made their way toward the tree line. They had almost reached it when a shout went up from the direction of the stable. "Over there!" By the trees, Preston pushed Theo ahead of him. "Run!" he urged, drawing his pistol as he turned to face their pursuers. Theo hesitated, unwilling to leave him, but Preston's expression brooked no argument. "Go, Theo, I'll be right behind you." Heart pounding, she plunged into the forest, Rusty at her side. Behind her, she heard the sharp report of Preston's gun, answered by multiple shots from their pursuers. She wanted to look back, to ensure Preston was following, but fear drove her forward, deeper into the protective darkness of the trees. The forest was dense, the undergrowth catching at her skirts, slowing her progress. Rusty stayed close, occasionally guiding her around obstacles she couldn't see in the darkness. Every sound behind her made her heart lurch. Was it Preston following, or Charles's men? She had gone perhaps a quarter mile when Rusty suddenly stopped, hackles rising as he stared back the way they had come. Theo halted, pressing herself against a large tree trunk, straining to hear over the sound of her own ragged breathing. Footsteps approached, heavy and purposeful. Rusty's growl deepened, but he didn't bark or move to attack. Then a familiar whistle, Preston's signal to the dog, cut through the night. Rusty immediately relaxed, his tail wagging with recognition. "Preston," Theo called softly, relief flooding through her. "It's me," he confirmed, emerging from the shadows. Even in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, she could see the dark stain spreading across his left sleeve. "You're hurt," she gasped, moving to his side. "Just a graze," Preston assured her, though the tightness around his eyes belied the casualness of his tone. "We need to keep moving. They're not far behind. Can you ride?" A new voice spoke from the darkness, causing both of them to whirl in alarm. But it was only the stable boy, leading Belle by the reins. "Figured you might need her more than they do," the youth explained with a shrug. Preston stared at the boy in astonishment. "Why would you help us?" The stable boy's expression hardened. "My sister was married to a man like him once. He beat her so bad she lost an eye before she got away. Some men don't deserve loyalty." He handed Belle's reins to Preston. "Eastern Trail splits about a mile ahead. Take the North Fork, it's less traveled but faster to Riverdale." "Thank you," Theo said fervently, touched by this unexpected ally. The boy nodded once. "Better hurry. They're organizing a proper search." With Preston's help, Theo mounted Belle, then he swung up behind her despite his injured arm. The stable boy had already disappeared back toward the settlement, moving quickly and quietly through the trees. They rode hard through the night, following the boy's directions, pushing Belle as much as they dared on the uneven, snow-covered trail. Rusty loped alongside, occasionally ranging ahead but never venturing far. Dawn was breaking when they finally spotted Riverdale in the valley below a proper town with several streets, a church steeple, and most importantly, a telegraph office. They approached cautiously, aware that Charles might have sent men ahead to watch the larger settlements. "We'll stop at the sheriff's office first," Preston decided, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. The wound on his arm had stopped bleeding, but his face was pale beneath his tan, his strength clearly flagging. "Explain the situation. Get protection while we contact Holloway." Theo nodded, too tired to argue, though concern for Preston's condition was rapidly overshadowing her fear of capture. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, a solid brick building on the main street, where an older man with a star pinned to his vest was sweeping the front step. He looked up at their approach, his weathered face impassive as he took in their disheveled appearance, Preston's blood-stained sleeve, the exhausted horse. "Trouble?" he asked simply, leaning his broom against the wall. "Yes," Preston replied, sliding from Belle's back and helping Theo down. "My name is Preston Wolcott. This is Theodora Varley. We need protection and a telegraph line to Denver." The sheriff's eyebrows rose at Theo's name. "Varley? As in Charles Varley, the banker?" Theo's heart sank. If Charles's influence extended even to this remote town. "Her husband," Preston confirmed, his hand moving subtly toward his gun. "Who has men pursuing us with intent to harm?" The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Theo's surprise, he nodded. "Better come inside, then." "Got a telegram about you two yesterday from Sheriff Daniels over in St. Joe. Said you might be headed this way, and that Charles Varley's claims about his wife were horseshit." Relief made Theo's knees weak. Preston's arm came around her waist, supporting her as they followed the sheriff into his office. "Name's Haskell," the lawman said, gesturing them toward chairs. "Been sheriff here 20 years. Seen my share of men chasing wives who had good reason to run." He poured 3 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove, passing them to his exhausted visitors. "Now, suppose you tell me the whole story, and we'll figure out how to proceed." Over the next hour, they explained everything: Theo's escape from Charles, Preston finding her in the woods, their months together at the cabin, the recent pursuit and discovery. Sheriff Haskell listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or nodding at particular details. "This lawyer in Denver," he said when they had finished. "Holloway, you trust him?" Preston nodded firmly. "With my life, and with Theo's." "Good enough for me." Haskell rose, stretching his back. "I'll have my deputy escort you to the telegraph office. Then we'll get that arm looked at, Mr. Wolcott, while we wait for a response." True to his word, the sheriff arranged for them to send a detailed message to Michael Holloway, explaining their situation and location. He then had his deputy accompany them to the local doctor, who cleaned and properly bandaged Preston's wound, a bullet graze that, while painful, had done no serious damage. "You're lucky," the doctor observed as he finished his work. "An inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Preston's eyes found Theo's across the small examination room. "I'm well aware of how lucky I am," he said softly. They were provided a room at the local hotel under guard, with strict instructions to rest while awaiting Holloway's response. The bed was narrow but clean, and Theo found herself almost immediately drifting toward sleep, the events of the past 2 days catching up to her at last. Preston settled beside her, his good arm pulling her close. "Sleep," he murmured against her hair. "We're safe for now." Theo wanted to protest, to suggest he take the bed while she kept watch, but exhaustion won out. She surrendered to sleep, secure in Preston's embrace, Rusty a warm presence at the foot of the bed. It was late afternoon when a knock at the door roused them. Sheriff Haskell entered at Preston's acknowledgement, a telegram in his hand. "From your lawyer friend," he said, passing the paper to Preston. "Arrived about an hour ago. Let you rest before bringing it up." Preston scanned the message, his expression shifting from concern to cautious optimism. "Holloway's sending a federal marshal," he explained to Theo. "They'll be here by tomorrow evening to escort us to Denver. The investigation into Charles's banking practices has advanced significantly. They've been building a case for months, apparently." "What does that mean for us?" Theo asked, hope warring with anxiety. "It means Charles is about to have bigger problems than a runaway wife," Preston replied. "Federal fraud charges carry serious penalties, prison time, substantial fines. His influence with local judges won't help him there." Sheriff Haskell nodded approvingly. Nothing brings down a powerful man faster than the federal government deciding he's worth their attention. He moved toward the door. I'll have food sent up. Suggest you both keep out of sight until your escort arrives. Varley's men were spotted in town an hour ago, asking questions. The next 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Theo and Preston confined to their hotel room, meals brought up by the sheriff's deputy, Rusty growing increasingly restless at the confinement. They spent the time planning, Preston sharing what he knew of Holloway and the legal process that awaited them in Denver. Once the marshal arrives, we'll be under federal protection, he explained. Charles won't dare move against us openly then. And if we succeed, if Charles is convicted? Theo asked, allowing herself to imagine a future truly free from her husband's shadow. Preston took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band she still wore, his mother's ring, a symbol of their pretend marriage that had become something far more real. Then you'll be granted a divorce on grounds of cruelty with no contestation possible from a man in prison, he said. You'll be legally free, Theo, free to decide your own future. Our future, she corrected softly, her fingers interlacing with his. The arrival of the federal marshal the following evening marked the beginning of the final chapter in their ordeal. Marshal James Ryder was a tall, austere man with a reputation for incorruptibility and a determination to see justice served. He listened to their story with professional interest, taking detailed notes and asking precise questions. Mr. Holloway has prepared thoroughly, he informed them when they had finished. Your testimony, Mrs. Varley, will be essential, but it's only part of a larger case. Your husband's financial crimes have left a significant paper trail. The journey to Denver was undertaken with military precision, Theo, and Preston traveling in a private compartment on the eastbound train, Marshal Ryder and 2 deputies maintaining a constant guard. Rusty, after some negotiation, was allowed to accompany them, the marshal recognizing the dog's protective value. As the Colorado landscape flashed past the train windows, Theo found herself gripped by a complex mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly, at the thought of seeing Charles again, of standing against him publicly. But also a growing determination, a certainty that what she was doing was right not just for herself, but for others who might suffer under Charles's influence if he remained unchecked. And beneath it all, a steady current of hope, anchored in the presence of the man beside her. Preston Wolcott, who had found her broken in the woods and promised healing, who had kept that promise through danger, sacrifice, and unwavering support. What are you thinking? Preston asked, noticing her pensive expression as they neared Denver. That I never expected to return to this city, Theo admitted. Certainly not like this, head held high, with the law on my side. Preston's smile was warm with pride. You're not the same woman who fled in the night, Theo. You're stronger now, braver. Because of you, she said, squeezing his hand. No, Preston corrected gently, because of yourself. I just provided the space for you to remember who you always were beneath the fear. The trial that followed their arrival in Denver became the sensation of the season, the respected banker Charles Varley facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and domestic violence. His estranged wife the key witness for the prosecution. Society matrons who had once snubbed Theodora for perceived social infractions now watched in horrified fascination as she testified to years of abuse, her quiet dignity more damning than any hysterics could have been. Throughout the proceedings, Preston remained a constant presence, his steadfast support never wavering. Michael Holloway proved every bit as formidable as Preston had promised, his methodical presentation of evidence dismantling Charles's carefully constructed facade piece by piece. Charles, for his part, maintained the haughty demeanor that had intimidated so many for so long. But as the trial progressed, as former business associates testified to his underhanded dealings and household staff confirmed Theo's accounts of abuse, cracks began to appear in his composure. The moment of his breaking came during cross-examination, when Holloway presented evidence that Charles had orchestrated the burning of Preston's cabin, not merely property damage, but attempted murder. Confronted with this, with the knowledge that federal charges of far greater severity could be added to those he already faced, Charles's famous control finally shattered. His rage, so long directed at Theo behind closed doors, exploded in the public courtroom. The invective he hurled at his wife, the naked hatred in his expression as he lunged toward her, required 3 bailiffs to restrain, but achieved what months of testimony might not have. In that moment, every person in the courtroom, from the judge to the most skeptical juror, saw the monster behind the respectable mask. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Charles Varley was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. The divorce was granted immediately, the judge's sympathy for Theodora evident in his unusually generous financial settlement, though much of Charles's fortune was forfeit to the government. Enough remained to ensure Theo would never want for material comfort. "It's over," Holloway said as he joined them outside the courthouse after the final hearing. "You're free, Mrs. Varley, or should I say, Miss Varley once again." Theo glanced at Preston, a silent communication passing between them. "Actually," she said, a smile blooming on her face, "I'm hoping it will be Mrs. Wolcott before too long." Holloway's eyebrows rose, though his expression was more amused than surprised. "I see. Well, that explains a great deal about Preston's determination in this case." He shook Preston's hand warmly. "Congratulations to you both. You've earned your happiness." As they walked away from the courthouse for the final time, Theo felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what it was to stand truly straight. The Denver street bustled around them, people going about their lives, none paying particular attention to the well-dressed woman and the somewhat rugged man with a dog at their heels. "What now?" Theo asked, her arm linked through Preston's, the sun warm on her face. "Your cabin was destroyed." "We rebuild," Preston replied simply. "Better than before, unless—" He paused, studying her face. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in the city. With your settlement, we could afford a nice house here or in St. Joe if you'd prefer something smaller." Theo shook her head decisively. "The city holds nothing for me now. I want the mountains, the valley, the peace we found there." She smiled up at him. "I want home, Preston, our home." The kiss he gave her then, in full view of Denver society, sealed that promise more effectively than any words could have done. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Preston's eyes held the future she had once thought forever denied to her. "Then home we'll go, my love," he said. "And this time, when we say I do, it won't be for anyone's benefit but our own." Spring came early to the Colorado mountains the following year, wildflowers carpeting the valley below the new cabin that stood on the site of the old. Larger than its predecessor, with wide windows to catch the mountain light and a deep porch where Rusty loved to doze in the afternoon sun, it had been built with care and attention to detail a true home rather than merely a shelter. On a perfect May morning, with the aspen leaves just unfurling their bright green against the darker pines, Theodora Varley became Theodora Wolcott, in a simple ceremony attended by their closest friends Sheriff Daniels from St. Joe, Michael Holloway from Denver, the stable boy, whose name they had learned was Timothy, who had helped them escape that fateful night, and a few of the more discreet townspeople who had supported them through the trial. Preston had insisted on building a proper arch where they exchanged their vows. Covered in early climbing roses from plants Theo had lovingly tended since their return to the valley. Rusty served as ring bearer, the simple gold bands tied to his collar with blue ribbon, his dignity in the role somewhat undermined by his enthusiastic tail wagging. "I found you broken in these woods," Preston said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes as he recited the vows he had written himself, "and promised you would heal. What I didn't know then was how much my own healing depended on yours. You taught me that solitude isn't the same as peace, that strength sometimes means asking for help, that love is worth every risk." He slipped the ring onto her finger, replacing the one that had been his mother's with a new band that symbolized their future rather than their past. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to honor your courage, to cherish your heart, and to thank whatever fate or providence led me to you that day in the forest." Theo's own vows, spoken through tears of joy rather than fear, echoed his commitment and added her own promises to trust in their shared strength, to build a home filled with warmth and honesty, to never take for granted the freedom they had fought so hard to secure. The small gathering celebrated well into the evening, lanterns illuminating the yard as they shared food, stories, and hopes for the couple's future. When the last guest had departed, Sheriff Daniels riding back to town with promises to visit again, soon Preston and Theo stood on their porch, arms around each other, watching the stars emerge above their mountain home. "Happy?" Preston asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "More than I ever thought possible," Theo replied honestly. She turned in his arms to face him fully, her expression suddenly serious. "I have something to tell you, something I've been waiting to be certain of before sharing." Concern flickered across Preston's face. "Is everything all right?" In answer, Theo took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach, still flat but containing the most precious of secrets. "More than all right," she whispered, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. "We're going to have a baby, Preston. A child born in love and safety, who will never know fear in their own home." The joy that transformed Preston's features was more brilliant than any sunrise Theo had ever witnessed. He lifted her into his arms, spinning her in a circle of pure elation before setting her carefully back on her feet, his hands moving to cradle her face with infinite tenderness. "A family," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our family." "Our future," Theo agreed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the first stars winked into existence above the valley that had witnessed their journey from strangers to saviors to beloved partners. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled welcomingly. Rusty already settled on his rug beside the hearth. Outside, Belle grazed contentedly in the moonlit pasture. The cattle Preston had rebuilt his herd with lowing softly in the distance. And in the surrounding forest, the wind whispered through pines that had stood witness to a desperate woman's flight, and the cowboy who had found her a love story written not in grand gestures but in quiet courage, unwavering support, and the healing power of being truly seen and valued. As Preston led his wife, his real, legal, beloved wife, into their home, Theodora Varley reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was the love that had helped her heal, the strength she had discovered within herself, and the future that stretched before them, bright with promise, rich with possibility, and above all, free from fear. In the heart of the Colorado wilderness, they had found not just safety, but something far more precious. A love powerful enough to overcome the darkest of pasts and light the way to a future neither had dared to dream possible.